Hi, my name is Chris Melnick and I'm a realtor in Halifax, Nova Scotia. In the previous video, I mentioned that if you meet with builders to discuss one of their plans with specs, they're often able to later give you a detailed contract with pricing to review. Today, I'm going to talk about comparing builders' quotes and contracts and what you should be paying attention to. Now, prior to comparing the contracts with clients, I put all the information in relevant categories in a spreadsheet, so it's much easier to understand. There can be an infinite number of variables and many small differences that could add up to a big one. So organization is key, and I just like spreadsheets. Now, this is an example of what I might put together. As you can tell, these are all just made up companies and altered numbers to give you an idea of how you might go and evaluate and think of some of the contracts. But these are based off of actual quotes and contracts. The whole point of this exercise is to compare the different builders' spec homes and how they typically do things. Because like I said before, all builders are going to do things differently and they kind of do things their way. Oftentimes you can later get that customized to what you want, but initially they're going to basically propose what they usually do and how they usually do things. So I use that as a starting point. So I'll just go down this list and go through the categories and then talk about them a little bit and which ones you should be paying attention to the most and how to think of different categories. So first, the model. It'll be usually some cool, trendy place name. Here you have the type of home. So you can see split entry, split entry, split entry. That's very similar in this case. It could be two-story, it could be a slab-on-grade bungalow, could be all sorts of things. Next, price. I mean, this is probably the biggest line item. So you can see these are all pretty similar. And even the square footages are all pretty similar, because what you'll see is that oftentimes if you go to the bigger builders and look at their spec plans, they'll have some very, very similar spec plans for the same category of home. Because when one builder releases a new plan in a year or two, it'll just kind of float all over the place and all builders will do their own version of it if it's a good plan. But there may be little differences, like in this case, the sizes. So since these prices are slightly different and since the square footages are different, that's when usually I just go, okay, price per square foot, and that gives us the best idea of what home is really the cheapest. Next, the timeline. So when you're visiting builders, usually one of the big questions is when will it be finished? So the answer is usually something along the lines of, well, it'll be, 11 months after the contract is signed, be 10, could be 8. I mean, this is pretty well typical. When COVID was happening, sometimes it was over a year, and before COVID, when the market was slower, and then it could be done in a fair bit less time. But you also want to ask if it's when the contract is completed or if it's when the permits are received, because sometimes that's different and it could cost you an extra month or so. Next, these two clauses are something you really should pay attention to. The first is a closing date clause, because even though they say typically we finish our homes in 11 months and we've got a great track record, etc., is there anything in writing that says they have to complete it? Because I mean, at the end of the day, they could just go, oh, well, we're lagging behind this and that. Oh, maybe it's 12, maybe it's 14 months. Now, maybe you don't care. Or maybe you're selling your home and you really are counting on that date to be done. Sometimes you can get fairly accurate dates, but in this case, it's unlimited. And this one, it's unlimited. So even though, they've got a great reputation, and I'm sure that these companies will be very close, there's nothing legally that says they have to be. Whereas in this case, they're saying it's guaranteed after it's roof tight. So that's basically after, they've done the foundation, they've done the framing, they've got shingles on it, it's waterproof, and then they're actually going to guarantee a date. Next is the price adjustment clause. This used to not be a thing before COVID, but during COVID, when prices went up a lot, they had to introduce this. Because if you can imagine, if you're a builder and you're trying to price out a job, and you're pricing things out based on 2x4s costing $3 or $3.50 a piece, and then it jumps to $11 like it actually did, that justifiably would throw things off and you could end up losing money on a job. So not to say that they're doing anything nefarious, it's just that you would want to know if the home price at the end of the day could go higher, because during COVID, there was cases where people had a certain amount of money to spend on a home, and then because of price increases of lumber and things like that, the cost of the house went up and now they can't afford the house. And now they actually have to break the contract because they cannot close. And it's unfortunately the buyer's problem and the buyer's fault because there was an unlimited price adjustment clause in there. Whereas sometimes some builders, they'll just say, no, we guarantee the price. So even if the prices go up, we will eat that. So we'll pay it. So it's almost like an insurance policy. Now, the more risks that the builder takes on, the more they're probably going to charge you, because they're not going to take that risk for free. Next, these are the allowances. Now, the concept of an allowance is kind of interesting. It's like an amount of money or a budget that the builder is allocating for certain jobs. So it's something along the lines of, well, if we don't know exactly how much something is going to cost, out of the total contract price, we'll allocate, say, $50,000 for the excavation, site work, and for septic. So what this means is that when they start working on the job, that's when they really start to know how much it's going to cost, because maybe they start digging and they figure out, well, we didn't expect all this rock to be down there, and that's going to complicate things a lot more. So that's a risk. So they're saying, well, maybe on a lot of our jobs, $50,000 would cover it. But if they find something else, and maybe this stage would cost $80,000, you're now paying the difference. So you're now paying the $30,000. Another thing to ask on the topic of allowances with the builders is, what happens if you're under this amount? So let's say, what if it only cost $43,000? So technically there was $7,000 left in the budget. Do you get to keep it? Like, does it come back to you as a credit? Or does it just go back to the builder? And the builder says, well, we had kind of budgeted for this, but looks like we came under budget. We're keeping this. Because some builders will go either way. And that's going to be important. Now, I'm not saying these builders who do either method or, again, doing anything nefarious. It's just, it's good to know what they do and what's in the contract, just so you can set your expectations properly and just know what you're paying for. What are you buying? Next, very similar, water treatment allowance. So this is, we're assuming all of these homes are on well and septic. It's been septic up here. So when you're on a well, sometimes you can have too high levels of arsenic or lead, things like that. And there is guidelines that your water has to be at for these certain levels. And you can have treatment systems. So in this case, $3,000 for the treatment system, $5,000. In this case, they're saying there is no allowance. We just do it, which is great. But again, when a builder takes the risk, they have to basically pad that risk somehow. So you have to pay a bit of a premium for it. Next, lighting allowance. So it's the same concept. Taste in lighting changes completely. So it makes sense for there to be a lighting allowance. Now, the numbers typically are on the lower side because, I mean, again, this is for lights on the entire home. This is basically just the builder grade, like cheap of the cheap. Still totally decent, nothing wrong with them. But if you maybe have more expensive taste, like you can be spending $2,000 on just a chandelier. So it's something to think about. Now we've got cabinet/counter allowance. So now these builders, they just give you their kind of builder standard counter and cabinets. So if they're big builders, they probably even have samples in their showrooms or show homes. But this builder, they just give you an allowance. So what this means is that they'll give you $20,000 and you would go down to probably their preferred supplier, who maybe even gives them a discount on cabinets and counters, and you can then pick out what you want. Because with cabinet configuration, you can do all sorts of things, and they all cost different money. So if you want the little miniature pull-out spice rack for drawers, that's just going to cost you more money. So that's why they give you an allowance, just for more customization. Just know that things can get very expensive when it comes to counter and cabinets. Like for this sort of home, just having a quartz countertop throughout could be an extra $15,000. So if you're spending $15,000 just on the counters, it doesn't leave you a lot left. And I mean, realistically, the cabinets would probably cost you upwards of 15 grand. So if you were doing some high-end stuff, you're going to blow through that pretty quickly. But at least this way, you just have the builder standard written so you know what to expect. Next, flooring allowance. So again, this is very similar. They're just saying, okay, we're including laminate. And in this case, if you want something else, well, we're giving you 20 grand for that. Next, driveways. As standard, they're basically gravel, but you never know, you could get paved. So it's important to know this. If you're on a smaller city lot, having a paved driveway compared to gravel would probably be an extra like 5 grand or so. So it's not a big deal. But again, it's just the things to really, when you're scanning these contracts, to know. Because if you miss that, if you just assume something, you may face at the time when they go, oh, here's your house with a gravel driveway. And you thought it would be paved. And so in your mind, maybe you think you're getting $5,000 of less value, whereas that could have been the way it was written the entire time in the contract. Next, ceiling heights. So again, this is kind of a higher end builder, so they're just saying they just standard do 9 foot on both main floor and lower level. In this case, they normally do 8 foot on both, but for $15,000 more, you can get 9 foot high ceilings per floor. So if you want it on the main and lower, 9 foot highs, then that would be an extra $30,000. And then this builder just is 8 foots. Next, heat. This builder is a bit more higher end, so they're doing ducted heat pumps as standard. But these two builders, they do what is basically industry standard for new construction, which is electric baseboard, and then they'll give you a mini split. A mini split heat pump is extremely popular. They give you a cheaper source of heat and air conditioning. In this case, they're giving you one mini split, so this would likely be in the living room or family room, kind of blowing into the open kitchen area, maybe down the hallway. But they're giving you the option for an extra $5,000, you get an extra one. So if you want one on the lower level in the master bedroom, you can pay for that. Next, counter type. So in this case, well, it's in the allowance. In this case, it's the laminate is included and the quartz is an extra $15,000. And then in this case, it's solid surface, which means normally Corian. So as you can see, it's even though maybe these were the same, oh, I'm getting a counter and I'm getting cabinets. Well, now you look at it and it's like, oh, well, no, this one is actually better because they're just giving me a better countertop. Next, additional cost for ducted heat pump. Well, in this case, it was just included. And then in these different cases, $25,000 extra and $22,000 extra. Next, main floor laundry and pantry. So this actually just has to do with the design itself, because maybe, and this can be totally variable, so maybe you're very keen on having main floor washer and dryer and then having an actual walk-in pantry. And maybe some of these builders, they just don't have that. For example, this one does in their spec plan of the Whistler. And this one doesn't, and this one doesn't, for the Nunavut and the dog house. So this is just something to think about, because sometimes you can talk with a builder and you go, you know what, like, oh, I like this builder, but I really wanted X or Z. Sometimes they can actually change things around to fit these things in for you, but sometimes there's just no good space to do that. Finally, the deck. Because again, a lot of these spec homes, they'll just have a deck on the plan itself. So it's important just to kind of make note what they're offering. In this case, 12 by 10, no stairs, 16 by 12, no stairs, and then just none. So this just gives you a lot of the common categories. Now, again, I actually even simplified this. This was based on actual quotes I was comparing, and I just took out a bunch of other ones. But you can have as many as you need, because maybe there's some very unique attributes. There's skylights, there's a special style of door, something like that that you really like, and there's a new category. But this just gives you a way to look at it. And maybe even after this, you go, you know what? Even though this one seemed a bit high, but made sense because so many things were included. And the builder was taking more risk. But at the end of the day, when you really add in like a ducted heat pump upgrade, which is an additional $25,000, and then you upgrade for the quartz, which is $50,000, and that's $40,000 right there. which then bumps this one up to 630, and now the difference is quite a bit. So you may think, well, I thought this was a reasonable price before, but now maybe not so much. Whereas you may go, even though they have a lot of allowances, maybe you've done your research, like you actually went to the cabinet place and priced things out, or maybe you looked into what potentially the depth of the well could be, and you have a reasonable level of confidence that allowance will cover it. Then you may say, well, actually, even though a lot of the risks will be borne on me, I've done my research and I actually think this is a better deal. Alternatively, maybe things are just cheaper here and there's just a few things you want to change. You can go back to any of the builders and just try and negotiate with them and say, I like this aspect of what you're offering and this aspect of what they're offering. Could you put a closing date clause in there? Could you put a price adjustment clause in there? Granted, logically, anything extra you ask for, they're going to charge you money for it. That's just how things work. But it may be a decent value proposition for you. You may say, I'm actually more than happy to pay an extra 10 grand if I can have a price adjustment clause, because that way, in my mind, the additional losses would be limited to 10 grand opposed to being unlimited. So these are the things to think about, at least some of them. Hopefully this will basically give you a framework and how to compare these different homes. Even though they can be very similar from the outside, once you start getting down to the nitty-gritty and the terms, they can be fairly different. And this all comes down to your value proposition. What do you value and what makes sense? And then you can go back and forth with different builders until you settle on the builder and the agreement that you think is best for you. As always, I hope you've got some value from this video. Be sure to watch part 4, where I go into what the process is like once you've actually selected a builder and go through the home building process. My contact information is in the description. Goodbye.